My wife asked me if she could dance a song with Josh. We were at the company's holiday party, surrounded by colleagues, the lights dimmed, the muffled sound of conversation and laughter. And that question. Just that, can I dance a song with Josh? She didn't wait for my answer. She didn't need to. Because the answer didn't come from my mouth, it came from her eyes, the tone of her voice, the lightness with which she said his name. Josh. Any name. A name that, until that moment, was just another name among many, but that night took on weight, scent, color, and threat. I didn't answer. I just stood up. And left. Silence was all I could offer. And even if I had said something, I wouldn't have changed what was already decided within her. Because the truth, though still unspoken, had already been chosen. And it wasn't me. The dance started right after I walked through the door. I didn't see it. I didn't need to see it. I knew it. I knew it by the way she adjusted her dress, by the way she looked around to make sure I wasn't there anymore, by the way her smile widened before she even heard the music. It was a dance, but it was also an end. It was their first song and our last. And I felt it tearing something inside me that I hadn't known could still be torn. Outside, the night seemed normal. The wind hadn't changed. The world hadn't stopped. But something inside me died. And there was no funeral, no tears, no explanations. Just the certainty that she was no longer mine. Or maybe she never had been. They say that when betrayal happens, the hardest part isn't the broken trust. It's the shattered image. You start looking at the person and see someone else. And at the same time, it's like looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing yourself. Because if she could do this to me, what does that say about who I was with her? What does it say about everything we built? Everything I thought we were? That night, in the silence of the car, I asked myself this question over and over. And when the silence was already unbearable, that's when I realized my life with her was over even before that party. The dance was just the final push. Then I learned that Josh disappeared. There was no romance, no story, nothing beyond that dance. She was left. Alone. With the regret of having traded a home for a moment. And I rebuilt. Every piece. Every ruin. I went back to sleeping alone, I went back to eating in silence, I went back to looking at myself in the mirror and relearning how to breathe without pain. It was hard. The kind of hard you don't share. No one understands what it's like to be traded for a fantasy. To be left without warning. To be pushed out of a love you were still living. Some time later, I found someone. Not a replacement. Not a bandage. A whole woman. A woman who, when she looked at me, didn't compare me to anyone else. A woman who made routine a shelter, not an obligation. With her, I learned to smile again without fear. I learned that true love doesn't require effort to prove its worth. It just is. It happens. It endures even when the world falls apart. And it was when I finally started experiencing this that the old me came back. With wet eyes, a trembling voice, and a desperate attempt to explain to me what, deep down, not even she fully understood. I listened to her. Because holding on to resentment also imprisons. And I didn't want to be trapped by her pain anymore. I forgave. Not for her sake. For mine. But we didn't get back together. The cycle had ended. Love, that one, had moved on. And she kept trying to rebuild herself with what was left. What no one tells her, what is almost never spoken of, is what happens next. After forgiveness. After rebuilding. After the pain. She tried to move on. She tried to fill the void with other stories, other faces, other beds. But her name was still the same. And the mirror didn't lie. One random night, having dinner with a random man, she found herself distracted, trying to smile, trying to engage, trying to start over, until it slipped out. Quietly, involuntarily, almost like a whisper, my name. Not the name of the man in front of her. Mine. And in the next second, she saw the embarrassment in his eyes. And the shame. And the silence. And, once again, the abandonment. And it was there, over a glass of wine and a cold dish, that she finally understood that I had been the one. That true love cannot be replaced. That a 5-minute dance can cost a lifetime of peace. She cried in the bathroom of that restaurant. Not out of longing, but out of remorse. And, for the first time, she felt the true weight of the choice she had made. But fate, that cruel and ironic writer, still had one more page for her. Because, years later, she would see me again. And it wouldn't be in a chance encounter, nor in an attempt at reconciliation. It would be in an unexpected circumstance, which would place before her the final piece of this puzzle called consequence. It would be the moment when everything she didn't want to see would come to light. When everything she tried to ignore would become inevitable. And it is in that moment, in that final, silent, almost cruel encounter, that she would understand, definitively, what it means to lose something that can never be recovered. Because love, when it leaves, doesn't warn. And when it returns, it is no longer for her. But what happened at that last meeting? What did she see? What did I say? Or rather, what didn't I need to say? This is the part no one expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and we never support any kind of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but the feelings are real, because the mission of this channel is clear, to show how betrayal destroys loves, homes, and lives. Now take a deep breath. Because you're about to hear a shocking story, the kind that touches your heart. Prepare yourself, regret doesn't warn you when it arrives. They met on a sultry late afternoon, the kind that leaves the sky with hues that seem unreal, between the coral of the sunset and the gold that covers everything with a layer of hope. His name was Daniel, and he was never the type to attract attention at first sight. He had a serene air, eyes that observed more than spoke, and a walk that always seemed to measure his own steps. He worked in IT at a stable company and enjoyed strong coffee, non-fiction books, and quiet Sundays. He was a man of discreet routines and deep loves. He wasn't one of those who fell in love every week, and perhaps that's why, when he fell for her, it was with the abandon of someone who puts both hands in the fire without expecting to be burned. Her name was Emma, and she had a constant restlessness in her eyes, as if there was always something more to come. She had a laugh that filled the room, a classic beauty that was effortless, and a sharp intelligence that both charmed and intimidated. She worked in the communications department of the same company as Daniel, and it was precisely through an email exchange about a server problem that he first saw her, still unaware that this would be the beginning of something that would change his entire life. Emma was in a rush to live, spoke passionately, gave herself completely, and it was precisely this contrast between his stability and her intensity that made everything fall into place with an almost frightening ease. The beginning was light, almost cliché, after-work coffees, conversations that stretched late into the night, glances exchanged during meetings, little notes left on tables, the strange and delightful feeling of being pulled into a new universe. Daniel had never needed much to feel satisfied, but with Emma, everything became more colorful. For the first time, he found himself thinking about the future in concrete terms: travel, a home of his own, a dog, maybe children. And the most surprising thing was that she seemed to want exactly the same. 2 years later, they were married. A simple wedding, but filled with emotion. The vows were handwritten, with hand-picked words, spoken with teary eyes and whispered promises neither of them believed they would ever break. There was no luxury, no exaggeration. There was love. Enough love to fill the room where they said, "I do," enough love to make friends and family gasp at the way they looked at each other. Love, the likes of which is rarely seen. Their life together began with the enthusiasm common to newlyweds. Emma had always had an independent spirit, but with Daniel, she seemed to find refuge. He, in turn, discovered with her the joy of surprises, unexpected dinners, and endless conversations. They lived in a two-story house on the outskirts of a quiet neighborhood, with a wooden porch and a small vegetable garden that she insisted on tending, even though she didn't have much talent for it. The days passed peacefully, and although routine began to settle in, as happens with every couple, there was a quiet balance that sustained them both. Daniel was the kind of husband who remembered dates, who wrote notes in crooked handwriting, who noticed when Emma got a haircut. He was restrained in his gestures, but generous in his intentions. He knew what she liked to eat when she was tired, noticed when she needed silence, and respected her quirks. He never tried to curtail her freedom, and perhaps that's why she felt so comfortable with him. She was proud of the man she had married, spoke fondly of him to her friends, and although her restless heart sometimes asked for more than routine could offer, she seemed to know there was something rare, something solid there. Over time, challenges arose. Over time, tight deadlines, that subtle distance that sets in when work starts to take its toll. Emma was promoted, gaining prominence, spending more time away, dealing with short trips, late-night meetings, and seemingly endless demands. Daniel, even noticing the weariness in her eyes, remained the same, a firm presence, a silent love. She complained about his absences, the rush, the lack of time. He listened, understood, and did his best to make home a refuge, not a burden. There were never any serious fights. Arguments, yes, like any couple, but always followed by sincere reconciliations, light touches, and apologies exchanged in the twilight of the early morning. Still, there were times when Daniel looked at her and felt like he couldn't quite reach her. As if she were always 2 steps ahead, her mind elsewhere. It was a subtle thing, not exactly absence, but a distracted presence, as if part of her was waiting for something he couldn't offer. And yet, he tried hard. He tried hard because he believed that all love requires care, investment. Because he wanted to be her harbor, even when she seemed to prefer the open sea. On her side, there was a mess she couldn't always name. She loved Daniel, there was no doubt about that. But sometimes she missed something she couldn't tell if it was him or herself. She was afraid of settling, afraid of losing herself, afraid of becoming a version she would later regret. And at the same time, I was afraid of losing everything they had built. The security, the affection, the life that worked. So she carried on. Pretending it was only work that consumed her, pretending nothing was wrong. And so the days passed. With beautiful moments, yes. Laughing together at old shows, preparing simple dinners with bottles of wine opened for no reason, long hugs on lazy Sundays. But also with emptiness. Silences that dragged on longer than they should. Messages that took longer to be answered. Lost glances mid-sentence. Small, almost invisible cracks that only those who truly love can perceive. Friends still saw them as a strong couple, an example of partnership. At family lunches, birthdays, and casual get-togethers, everything seemed fine. But inside, Daniel was beginning to feel a kind of emotional fatigue, as if he were fighting something he couldn't name. Still, he wouldn't give up. Because love, for him, wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was choice. It was loyalty. It was patience. Emma, for her part, found herself increasingly torn. There were days when she loved him with absolute certainty. When she would lay her head on his chest and feel like that was where she belonged. But there were other days when she wondered who she was outside of that marriage. When she longed for something different, something new, something that didn't yet have a name, but that made her look at the world with growing unease. And it was in this scenario of silenced love and conflicting desires that something began to change. Slowly. Without fanfare. First, in small gestures. Then, in actions. To the point where a seemingly innocent question would be enough to break the tenuous thread that still held them together. But this was yet to happen. The rain fell heavily that night, as if the sky had decided to join in the turmoil gripping Emma's heart. For months, she and Daniel had lived in a silent truce, no arguments, but no laughter either. Words became brief, touch mechanical, and time a gap between what they had been and what they no longer were. The memory of the company party still lingered between them like a ghost neither dared to name, and Daniel's silence, that cruel, absolute silence, still echoed in her nights. He didn't ask anything. He didn't need to. His cold, resigned gaze already told her the answer was given. And since then, each of them continued trying to find a way to survive what was left. In the following months, Daniel threw himself into work and small renovations around the house, like someone trying to patch up the irreparable. Emma, on the other hand, sank into an automatic routine, fulfilling daily obligations but without truly being present. What was once a home became a minefield of memories, where any lingering glance could trigger an old pain. Still, there was respect. And, somehow, a last attempt to preserve what little remained. It was then that Daniel decided to leave. Not in anger, but in an act of liberation. He handed her an envelope with divorce papers and a simple note, "Don't hold on to guilt. Just move on." There was no scene, no long goodbye. He left on a gray morning, carrying only a suitcase and the certainty that love, when left untended, fades until it ceases to exist. Emma stood in the doorway, watching the car disappear into the distance, with the physical sensation of the breath being knocked out of her. Time passed. Months turned into years. Daniel rebuilt his life with calm and dignity. He smiled again, learned to cook, traveled, met new people. Until, one ordinary day, he met someone. A woman different from Emma, calmer, more mature, more serene. With her, love wasn't fire, it was shelter. And, for the first time since the end, he felt he could rest within another heart. Emma learned about this through mutual friends. The news hit like a blow. She feigned indifference, but that night, she cried until she had no more tears. The world moved on, but inside her, time remained trapped in that party, in that look, in that dance that never ended. She tried to move on too, new encounters, new attempts. But there was always something pulling her back to the past, something that prevented her from belonging to anyone else. It was on a random night that fate decided to exact the price of choices. Emma was in an elegant restaurant, dining with a man she had met weeks before. He was kind, polite, and had a light mood, and she made an effort to appear present. The wine was good, the music discreet, the conversation pleasant. For a moment, she almost believed she could start over. And then, like a bolt of lightning piercing the air, the man said something banal, perhaps about the taste of the dish, and she smiled. And in that smile, without thinking, without control, the name escaped. The name that should never have been spoken again. Daniel. The silence that followed was deafening. The man before her froze for a moment, surprised, then he slumped back slightly in his chair, trying to hide his discomfort. Emma felt her face heat, her entire body tremble, her heart pounding. She tried to explain, to say it was a mistake, a mix-up, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, politely, too understanding, and said with a forced smile that everything was fine. But it wasn't. Neither of them believed it. She went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. Her mascara was running, her makeup smeared, and it couldn't hide what her reflection cruelly revealed: she still loved him. Not with the passionate love of before, but with the kind of love trapped between regret and memory. The kind of love that hurts because it no longer has a place. She wiped away her tears, returned to the table, apologized, and ended the night in the silence of a taxi, gazing out the window at the city, while the driver talked about the weather that she barely heard. At home, she opened a bottle of wine and walked through the rooms as if revisiting a crime. Every object seemed like a reminder. The old photographs, the stored dress, the distant scent of his perfume still lingering on some of her clothes. She sat on the floor, surrounded by memories, and realized that time hadn't erased anything, it had only made the pain more polite. Meanwhile, Daniel was experiencing a moment of serene fulfillment. His new relationship was calm, filled with small gestures of affection and respect. Little by little, he was relearning to trust, to open up, to share his life without fear of being hurt again. The past still lingered, of course, but it no longer hurt. It was like a scar, visible, yet healed. It was then that the two crossed paths again. Chance, always cruel and poetic, caused them to meet at a downtown coffee shop one Saturday morning. Emma walked in distracted, talking on the phone, and saw him sitting by the window, smiling. The shock was immediate. Her heart raced, and for a moment she considered leaving, pretending she hadn't seen him. But he noticed her. Their eyes met. There was a brief silence between the world and the moment. And, as if something greater compelled them, she approached. He stood politely and greeted her with a calm smile. Emma tried to maintain her composure, but her voice faltered as she said his name. She asked how he was, how life was going. He responded calmly, without rancor, without pain. He spoke of his routine, his work, the small joys. And when she asked if there was anyone, he smiled in a way she recognized immediately. That smile was the same one that had once been hers alone. He said yes, there was someone, and that he was happy. Emma tried to smile, but the gesture was accompanied by suppressed tears. She said she missed the times when everything was simpler, that sometimes she thought about how things could have been different. Daniel listened in silence. Then, with a calm voice and a firm gaze, he said, I thought about that too for a long time. But I realized that what we destroyed wasn't love, it was trust. And trust, when you leave, doesn't come back the same. She took a deep breath, trying not to break down right there. She said she never wanted to hurt him, that she didn't know how to stop being who she was back then, that she lost herself trying to find herself. He nodded understandingly. I understand, she replied. And it's because you understand that I forgive you. But forgiveness isn't an invitation. It's just the door closing peacefully. The conversation ended with a restrained hug. He said goodbye and left. Emma stood, watching through the window as he walked hand in hand with the new woman, the same one who had been waiting for him on the sidewalk. The scene was simple, yet poignant. A gesture that said more than any words, he had moved on. That night, Emma returned home and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty space around her. She picked up her phone and opened an old photo of them, taken some random summer, when they were still happy. She smiled sadly, touching the screen as if reaching for something that no longer exists. And, for the first time, she accepted the truth she'd avoided for so long. It wasn't the betrayal that drove him away, it was her lack of courage in choosing the right love at the right time. From that moment on, she understood the true weight of choices. She understood that love doesn't die from one blow, but from successive oversights. And that sometimes, when we realize it, it's too late to get back. She deleted the photo, erased the old messages, and, with trembling hands, dropped her phone onto the mattress. Tears flowed, silent, without drama, just the sound of a heart finally realizing what it had lost. And it was like that, between regret and silence, that Emma realized how much a single word, said or unsaid, can change the destiny of two lives. In the months that followed their reunion, Emma sank into a silent state of reflection that only those who have lost something irreversible can understand. She no longer cried as before, with despair or anger. Now it was a different kind of crying, contained, resigned. A crying that came slowly, in the middle of a song, in the smell of an old t-shirt, in the sudden memory of any given Sunday. Time passed, and with it, the realization became increasingly clear, what she had let slip wasn't just a man. It was an entire life, a version of herself that existed only with him, a part of her heart that could not be rescued. The void was filled with attempts, new encounters, forced smiles, lukewarm conversations. But no hug felt the same way his did. No laugh echoed in her chest in the same way. And, most cruel of all, was knowing that the mistake she had made wasn't the result of chance, but of choice. A conscious choice, made in a moment of doubt that cost everything that was safe and true. Emma tried to move on. She resumed old hobbies, pursued new projects, traveled alone, sought therapy. But there was always something missing, an absence that took up too much space. At lunches with friends, when his name came up casually, she would just smile sadly and change the subject. There was nothing left to say. The past no longer allowed for editing. Sometimes she wrote letters that would never be sent, trying to put into words what remained trapped inside her. Words of love, of guilt, of longing. In one such letter, she wrote, "You were my home, and I exiled myself." That sentence, more than any other, summed it all up. She exiled herself from her own love, believing she would find something greater, but found only the silence of an irreparable mistake. On the other side, Daniel experienced the peace he'd always sought. With his new wife by his side, he rebuilt the foundations of his life with maturity and calm. There was no euphoria, but there was harmony. Love didn't need shouting, it didn't need proving anything, because it existed in everyday gestures, in mutual support, in conversations that ended in laughter rather than arguments. She, unlike Emma, didn't seek challenges in every situation, nor did she question the future at every difficulty. She was present. And with her, Daniel learned that love doesn't have to be a battlefield to be intense. His new partner made him feel something he never imagined he'd feel again: belonging. One day, he found an old box of memories stored in the attic. Inside were photos, old letters, handwritten notes in Emma's handwriting. There was poetry there, and also pain. He sat with the box on his lap for a long time, silently reading one by one the memories of a life that was no longer his. He felt longing, but not a desire to return. Because he understood that longing isn't always an invitation, sometimes it's just memory's way of honoring the good. He closed the box, put everything back, and in that act, there was no resentment, only respect for what he had experienced. And, most of all, gratitude for having left in time to avoid losing himself. The years passed, and eventually, their paths stopped crossing. Emma heard that Daniel had remarried, that he had adopted his new wife's daughter as his own, and that together they had built a small but solid family. This touched her deeply. There was no jealousy, but there was a dull ache at the thought of what could have been. On a cold autumn afternoon, she was walking alone through a park when she saw a scene in the distance that made her stop. Daniel was sitting on a bench with his wife beside him and a child in his arms. He was laughing naturally, his eyes closed, his wife's hand clasped in his, and the child was pointing at something in the sky. It was a living painting of what she had always wanted but had been unable to preserve. Emma stood there, distant, watching in silence. When they got up and left, she took another path, her steps slow and her heart heavy. Time, relentless, taught Emma that the true punishment for betrayal doesn't always come in the form of abandonment, but in the awareness that lingers. There is no greater pain than realizing that the love you lost was, in fact, what you always sought. She learned to live with this loss, to transform regret into maturity, to become a better person, even if it didn't lead her back to what she lost. In a conversation with a friend years later, she summed it up: "I was loved in a way few people are. And I let it slip away. Today, my greatest lesson is this: true love is a daily choice. And I chose wrong." Daniel, in turn, aged gracefully. Traumas were addressed, fears healed, wounds healed with time and with the delicacy of a new love that didn't require him to reinvent himself every day to be accepted. He was loved exactly as he was. On his 50th birthday, surrounded by friends and his new family, he gave a short speech, but one that remained in everyone's memory. He said that life taught him that pain doesn't always mean the end, sometimes, it's just the beginning of something greater. And that forgiveness, when true, doesn't need to bring someone back, it simply frees us to move on. At the end of this story, we are left with the memory of the glances met, the words left unsaid, the choices that echo forever. Emma now lives a peaceful life. She has never remarried. She has found balance within herself, but she knows that what she felt with Daniel will never return. She carries this love like someone carrying a beautiful scar. It no longer hurts, but it never fades. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how this story touched you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future moving stories like this one. This story is a powerful reminder: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it shatters trust, silences love, and leaves deep scars on the sufferer and, often, on the perpetrator. It's not worth giving up true love for a moment of doubt, vanity, or impulse. Love is a process of construction, of care, of daily decision. And when you choose wrong, the price can be a lifetime of longing. Here on this channel, we do not support, romanticize, or justify any kind of betrayal. We are here to tell stories that touch, alert, and make us reflect. That serve as a lesson to never repeat the same mistakes. Until the next story.